Okay, thanks, Victor. As Victor said, one example of a project that we can look at with enormous, large data sets is a study of the geographies of information and knowledge. And understanding the geographies of knowledge is really a crucially important task because it allows us to get at issues of power and voice and representation, and it allows us to ask questions like who has access, what are the constraints to sharing, where is knowledge, who controls it, and who, what, and where are still left out of these global debates and representations and flows of knowledge. And these are big questions, of course, but again, thanks to the support of the CONVOCO Foundation, we were able to draw on some really enormous data sets and create some snapshots of the geographies of knowledge that I'm about to talk to you about. And that's what this talk will be about for the next few minutes. We're not claiming to be able to paint a conclusive picture about the geographies of knowledge, but by drawing on some of these examples, we're able to make some important conclusions about voice, representation, and ultimately power. Now, the first question that we wanted to ask was, what are some of the enabling and constraining factors behind the production of knowledge? And we did this by looking at two main variables. First, something that's a simple prerequisite for most types of meaningful participation in knowledge sharing, that's literacy. And second, we looked at internet use as a way of thinking through some of the more social and technical barriers to the dissemination of and access to knowledge. So I'll talk about these first, and then we'll get into a few more snapshots of where knowledge and information actually is. So first, literacy. This is a map that shows you the percentage of adults in countries that are literate, and the breakdown of those statistics in some of these countries by gender. The darker colors on the map mean that there's higher literacy rates. The darkest colors on the map mean that there's almost everyone in that country is literate. So what you basically see is that in much of the world, we approach full literacy. In North America, in all of Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, a lot of East Asia, you see this. But then you get much of the rest of the world with significantly lower literacy rates. Look at South and Central America. You get rates in between 80 and 90% of people are literate. Look at the Middle East. You get rates of 70 to 80% of people are literate there. But then shockingly, there are 21 countries on our planet in which a majority of the population cannot read or write. In Niger, for instance, only 29% of people are literate. And what's also important to point out here are the significant gender gaps in literacy. Look at India, for instance. In India, India has a literacy rate of 61%. And by the way, according to the last census, what that meant is that there were over 450 million illiterate Indians. So India, with a literacy rate of 61%, actually had a male literacy rate of 73%, but a female literacy rate of 48%. So what that means is that there's more illiterate than literate women in India. In Afghanistan, the situation is even bleaker. There are 3 times as many literate men as there are women. Only 13% of women in that country can actually read or write. So the point of this is simply that there are these uneven geographies of literacy alone that are significant barriers to the production and the sharing of knowledge. But let's move on to talking about a second metric, to think about a key constraining factor behind the production and the dissemination of knowledge, and that's internet access. So much of the sharing and the creation of information that happens today happens online. So if you aren't connected, you simply can't participate in any of that. And this graphic is just a very simplistic way of showing you who's online. Each person here represents 25 million internet users. They're segmented by continent. So essentially a way of thinking of this is basically imagine the world or the internet were a village of, in this case, 62 people. What you would see then is that there'd be 27 Asians, 15 Europeans, 10 North Americans, 7 Latin Americans, and 3 Africans. But this only tells you part of the story. This map here is a map of global internet penetration. The size of each box here indicates the total number of users, and the shading indicates the penetration rate. So it's obviously very uneven. Some countries like the US over here have both a large total number of users and a high internet penetration rate. A lot of people, a high proportion of the population are in line there. China, in contrast, over there, has the world's largest internet population, but still a pretty low penetration rate compared to other countries. And then you get most of the rest of the world. Parts of South America, Africa, the rest of Asia, low total numbers of users and pretty low penetration rates. Look how, again, the map distorts each country based on how many internet users are in that country. So look how it shrinks South America, especially look how it shrinks the entire continent of Africa there. So I think also one interesting thing that this map does show you is the potential for significant growth of internet users or internet penetration in some parts of the world. Look at Indonesia, look at India, look at Nigeria, and you see very low penetration rates, but all these countries have very large populations, so they have the potential to become significant presences online. Now this chart here, this chart shows you the same data again, but maps it over time. And the purple bar over here, this is North America's number of internet users over time. What you see is that North America used to be the dominant region online. Most people online were North American. But what you see is this growth is sort of leveled off now. Compare that to the yellow bar right above it, that's Europe. The green bar right below it, that's Latin America. What you see is really high growth rates in both of those regions. And then look at Africa at the very bottom of this chart, but also in the last few years, a very impressive growth rate in terms of internet population. But it's Asia, the blue bar on this graph here, that really stands out on this map. And even with this growth rate, it shows no sign of slowing down over the next few years. Even China, that has the world's largest internet population, still, as I mentioned, has a pretty low penetration rate and potentially can have a much huger internet population in the next few years. Now, before moving on to showing you some of the other graphics and maps, I want to talk about the fact that a lot of this unevenness in internet access traditionally could be explained by the fact that some parts of the world simply weren't physically connected. This is a map, I'm not sure if you can make out the line here on the map. This is a map of fiber optic cables in Africa. And these fiber optic cables, that's what all your internet access runs through. That's what your international telephone calls run through. This is what all international digital communication moves through. Now, take a look at East Africa. This was the last major part of our planet that didn't have a single fiber optic cable running into it until a few years ago. But stories like this have changed. This, for instance, is the port of Mombasa in Kenya. The first fiber optic cable landed here about 2 years ago. This guy was kind enough to show me where it landed. And all of East Africa's connectivity passes through that hatch right there. Every email, every phone call goes through there out into the rest of the world. So the point of this is that these sorts of issues aren't necessarily a problem anymore. This is what the map of connectivity in Africa looks like now. Physical connectivity isn't necessarily an issue anymore. And what you're seeing is that this translates into lower internet prices, higher speeds, and which in turn, in part, explains some of the impressive growth rates of internet penetration that we've talked about. So what we're going to do now is look at whether these significant enabling and constraining factors to the access, the production, and the sharing of information help us in some ways explain the geographies of knowledge. What I'm going to do is talk about some measures of online knowledge geographies. But before I do that, I'm going to hand back over to Victor, who will talk about some more traditional metrics.
Thank you, Mark. So that means the hope could have been that perhaps with literacy rates up, although there is still a lot to do, with internet penetration rates up, although there's still a lot to do, we might actually end up in a Thomas Friedman-like flat world 2.0. Really? Maybe in terms of the fiber optic cables, but in terms of knowledge? Well, we looked first at two traditional sources or institutions of knowledge. The first source of knowledge that we looked at was knowledge about the world itself, how many literate people see the world. They see the world by reading newspapers. And so we looked at this very general sources of knowledge around the world. And then we looked at a particular kind or type of knowledge that was highly formalized and highly structured, and tried to see how the geography was in this particular area, in this particular category. The category that we chose was very specialized, formalized knowledge. We looked at academic knowledge. So let's look at generalized knowledge first. This map shows you how many newspapers around the world are published per 1,000 people. And the darker the color gets, as is typical of our maps, the more people read newspapers in a particular geographic location. What you see is a picture at first sight that is resembling the picture of literacy or the picture of internet penetration. North America, Europe, including all of Russia, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, relatively strong. Other countries relatively weak, especially Africa. But then look again. That actually is only half of the story. If you look closer, there is a lot more to see. Remember that Latin America has a high literacy rate. They just don't read newspapers. If you look at Europe, you have a very clear north-south differentiation. The north reads a lot, the south not so much. The literacy rates are practically the same. Look at the Middle East. There is literacy there, not as much as we would hope, but there is literacy, but they don't read newspapers. Now, if you don't read newspapers, you might not know much about the world. Some might think that depends on what newspaper you read, and I agree with that. But by and large, that is quite interesting. And look at India and China, always referred to as sort of these big developing nations, these big white elephants that are right around the corner. They have already a relatively high number of newspapers. And then we also mapped the circulation of the largest newspapers around the world and mapped them here. And you see that actually the largest newspapers around the world are not necessarily in North America. They are in Japan and China and India. So interestingly enough, that map is different from these enabling factors that I just talked about. Now that is generalized, traditional, if you want, knowledge. And here we show you the largest newspapers around the world. And what you see is the largest newspapers around the world are predominantly Japanese. These are the green ones. And then there are 2 British, 1 German, and 1 Chinese in the top 10. But who would have guessed that it's the Japanese who are the most avid newspaper readers? Now, this was generalized knowledge. But what we did also was to look at very specialized knowledge. There's a lot of talk about academic knowledge and how it is being shared and so forth. What we did was to look at 10,000 academic journals that are ranked with impact factors that sort of signify or reflect their quality from around the world. About 2/3 of which are from the natural sciences and 1/3 of which are from the social sciences. 10,000 of them. And we looked for each one of them at where is it published, what language is it published, does it publish in, and who is the publisher. And we found quite a different geography from the one that you might expect. This shows you where journals, academic journals around the world are being published, in which country, in which nation. What you see on the left is the United States, a huge blob. The color signifies the quality through the impact factor, the average impact factor of journals. So the darker the color, you would say, rule of thumb, the higher the quality, the average quality of a journal. You see the US really big. The United Kingdom, very big indeed, and so are the Netherlands, because of publishers, academic publishers, traditional academic publishers domiciled in these countries. Then this is the rest of Europe. Germany is still big, but suffering from low impact factors. Oh my God, look at France. This was a nation just about 120 years ago, 130 years ago, called the #1 academic nation in the world. Where is it today in terms of its publishing footprint in the academic world? And then here is the rest of Europe. Very big, relatively speaking, Switzerland. Now, of course, you see South America practically doesn't exist, or Latin America doesn't practically exist. Africa doesn't really exist. We hear a lot about the universities in China. But the blob is relatively light in color and relatively small. They have still perhaps some catch-up to do. And then Japan and Singapore and Australasia right here. But the one thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is that little country on the top. You see, that is the country with the darkest color. That means it publishes, by an average, the highest quality academic journals. And it is Denmark. And Denmark has this strategy of going for quality rather than quantity, ruthlessly. And it shows. So what we see here is, in fact, a relative, if you want, transatlantic oligopoly of academic knowledge. But you see interesting things, interesting nuances when you look more closely. Now, this is about the publication location. We also looked at languages. And there was a lot that you expected. This big blob is English-speaking publications. This on the right is all else together. This is Spanish, German, French, multilingual, Portuguese, and some smaller blobs. So clearly, as you expected, English rules academic publications. You expected that. But wait a minute, I can share some more insights here. The darkness of a blob also signifies quality. Now, look at Germany. German journals published in Germany are fewer than English journals published in Germany. And they are of lower quality. That is, an entire academic nation, Germany, is shifting slowly but steadily towards the English language. If you look at countries who have difficulties doing that, the one that is an obvious one is France, who is small and who seems to have a relatively low quality in the journals that they produce. Now, let me talk a moment about quality of journals. This does not mean that there is an objective measurement of quality of journals. This means that the quality is a reflection of how other people see what is being published in these journals. So if other people just don't read French, or don't read French well enough to understand the nuances and the depth of what is being published in French, too bad. So if I were a French scholar, I would of course publish in English. If I were an academic publisher in France, I would think about what to do. Because if you look at this blob, that is the English-speaking blob, then it is, France has a very small blob here, a very small area signifying English publication, English-speaking publication in France. But guess what? The quality is higher than their French-speaking ones. Now, thirdly, we looked at publishing houses, both for social sciences and for natural sciences. The reason for that is that there is this, if you want, contention out there that there is a high concentration among academic publishing houses, and that academic publishing houses have a bottleneck of control, hold control over information flows, and there is only a few academic publishing houses and a very big, and they create a certain concentration in the market space. To our surprise, we saw some concentration. The red field is publications that or publishing houses that publish in natural and social sciences, and these are individual publishers. They're very hard to read from that's Reed Elsevier, that's Springer, that's Wiley, that's Francis, Sage, and so forth, Kluwer. So you have large publishing houses, but you don't have just one or two or three or four. You have about a dozen large publishing houses. But when you look at only social science publications or only natural science publications, what you find out is that the market is wide open, that there are many players out in the market, and it's not as concentrated at all as you would expect. So it isn't the market that is concentrated in a way. Even though we see some concentration through language, we see some concentration through geographic locality. These are insights into traditional, existing sources of knowledge. Now, the hope is that the internet could shatter all this and change all this. And so we looked at it. And Mark is going to talk about that.
So exactly, I'm going to talk about online information. And the reason online information matters is not just because it's an increasingly important way in which we access and produce information, but also because it quite literally shapes how we move through, how we understand, and how we enact our physical, material environments. An ever-increasing amount of information out there is spatial. It has geography, and this is something we often forget in our internet age. This digital geospatial information surrounds us. It's layered throughout our material environments. And it shapes how we understand, how we produce, how we reproduce, how we enact, and how we reenact the cities that we live in. So what we set out to do was study some of these virtual mirrors that one of Google's vice presidents here is describing in this quote. We set out to ask where they are, what they're reflecting, and why they matter. And what we did was we started with this. We started with Flickr. Now, Flickr is the world's most popular photo sharing website. There are 5 billion photographs on this website. There are 5 billion photographs up here. And what we did was map every single one of them that has been geotagged. And that's what you see here. This is a measure of the density of images that are overlaid onto our planet. The brighter dots here mean that there are lots of images, or lots of photographs surrounding that place, augmenting that place. The darker dots mean that there are fewer, and no dots, of course, means that there's nothing there. I'm not sure if you can see the scale, but the brighter dots, a bright dot here, means that there are many, many more photographs about that place, augmenting that place, layered over that place, than the darker dots. So what you essentially see is that parts of Western Europe, North America, a few parts of East Asia have these really thick clouds of images overlaying them. Hundreds of thousands over some cities, millions over some cities. And then you get much of the rest of the world with very little. This cloud of information is very thin over a lot of the world. And this isn't related to population density at all. Look at somewhere like West Africa, a very highly densely populated part of our planet. Very little there. Look at the Indian subcontinent. Again, more than West Africa, but still a very thin cloud of information over that place. So let me show you these data in another way. These circles here that represent countries. And you probably can't read the labels from back where you are. But each country is sized, or each circle is sized according to the number of photographs taken about that place. So this giant one here is the US. There are 47 million photographs taken about that place. You have some European countries over here. The UK is the biggest one. France, Spain, Italy, Germany. You have Canada here, Japan, Australia, and Taiwan. And then everywhere else was just, the circles were too small to even bother putting up here. So very, very uneven representations of our world that are being uploaded, that are being shared on the internet. Now, it's not just photographs that are characterized by these very uneven geographic inequalities. What I'm going to talk about now is Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia is one of the world's largest collections of user-generated content. But what this essentially means is Wikipedia is an encyclopedia. Wikipedia, anyone can contribute to Wikipedia. Anyone can upload information to Wikipedia. Anyone can edit Wikipedia. But Wikipedia is by far the world's biggest and most used encyclopedia. It's 1,600 times bigger than the Encyclopedia Britannica. 15% of all internet users use it on any given day. It exists in 282 languages, and 40 of those language versions have over 100,000 articles in them. And the English one alone contains almost 4 million articles. So it's huge, it's big, lots of people access it. So what we wanted to do then was explore its geographies. And this is a map of Wikipedia that's made in a similar style to the one of the journals that you saw earlier, made in a similar style to the one of internet penetration that you saw earlier. The size of each rectangle here represents the number of Wikipedia articles in each country. So each rectangle is a country. The size of that country represents the number of Wikipedia articles in it. And the shading represents the density, or the number of articles by population. So a darker shade means that there's more articles per person in that country. A lighter shade means fewer per person. So what you see here is that a lot gets written about North America. This is North America over here, this big rectangle on the left. Even more gets written about Europe. It's this giant, almost square in the middle. And then very little is written about almost everywhere else. The rectangle over on the top right corner of the screen is Asia. That's all of Asia in that rectangle in the top right-hand side here. This is South America, this tiny rectangle. This is Africa. So again, the scale of these inequalities in something that's user-generated, that's peer-produced, that anyone can contribute to, that's freely available online is quite staggering. Look at Africa again. this rectangle, there's more written about the Netherlands, Poland, Ukraine than the entire continent of Africa. What's maybe even more shocking is that there's more articles written about Antarctica, which is over here, this is Antarctica, than most countries in Africa and a lot of countries in South America. Now, one thing that's obvious from this map is that it isn't simply explained by things like literacy or internet penetration that we've showed you. If you think back to internet penetration in Asia that we talked about, there are a lot of internet users there. Almost half of the world's internet population live in Asia, and yet people just simply aren't creating a lot of content about that continent. Now, what this map also shows you is that on a per capita basis, there's a lot of content about Europe. And that's something you'll see even more vividly on this graph here. Let me explain what you're looking at, because you probably can't read the labels from the back. The blue or the purple bars represent the population of a region. The brown bars represent the number of Wikipedia articles about that place. So we have Africa here, Antarctica, Asia, Europe, South America, and North America. Now, what this essentially just highlights is that there's a lot, in North America, a lot created per person. In Europe, even more created per person. And then that just entirely flips if you look at Asia, Africa, or South America. Now, just to expand on this high degree of visibility that's afforded to Europe, let me show you a few more maps of Wikipedia. In this next series of maps, what we did was map every single article about a person in the English version of Wikipedia. So any person that has a Wikipedia article about them has been mapped here. Now, what we did is map these by century. So this is everybody in Wikipedia that has an article about them that was alive in the 15th century. Look at the pattern here. Very, very Eurocentric. This now is the 16th century. Again, heavy concentrations of our interest, our knowledge about the world, our knowledge about people, almost entirely in Europe. This is the 17th century. The 18th century, you see a bit more diffusion. You see more articles, more knowledge about North America. Still almost nothing about the rest of the world. Even the 19th century, still a heavy focus on Europe. We start to have a lot of information about people in North America. Still very little about the rest of the world. And then finally, the 20th century. Here we at least get some information about people that lived in Japan, Korea, India, South America, parts of Africa, but an incredibly Eurocentric, Western-centric view of the world here. Now, granted, we're only looking at the English Wikipedia here, not the Chinese or the Hindi or the Thai versions of Wikipedia, but still, this is what we're learning about the world. This is the information that we have access to about the world. Now place all of this within the context of one of Wikipedia's mottos, which is to contain the sum of all human knowledge. So it's clearly a dangerous idea to imagine that we're even getting close to having a platform that contains the sum of all human knowledge. And instead, we obviously need to keep a focus on some of these significant biases that are embedded into this knowledge, which plays a key role in shaping our understandings of the world. So I'm going to stop talking about Wikipedia here and let Victor talk about the platform that most of us probably access the internet through.
So Mark talked about Wikipedia, and my students, our students, when they look something up, they go to Wikipedia. They don't go to the Encyclopedia Britannica anymore. If something isn't in Wikipedia, then they think it doesn't exist. What does this do for people, young people, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, who explore the world through Wikipedia, when their continent, when their country, when their history barely exists? What does this do to our children when they look at Wikipedia and see the density of information, the richness and the depth of information that is there? But then you might say, Wikipedia is just one site. There is the other big site, the Google. Google today gets about 3 billion search requests every day. Through Google, we see, we understand, we perceive the world. The saying is, if you're not in Google, you don't exist. Now, what we did in the final visualization that we'd like to show you tonight as part of the Geographies is we looked at Google Maps, at the geographies that Google provides. And you might not know, but you, I, everyone can add to Google Maps. We can add our own information to Google Maps. And many, many millions of people do that. And so Google Maps is a very rich interface. But rich in what way? Well, we looked at all the geotagged entries that are user-generated, the geo-entries on the Google Maps that are user-generated, and we looked at what they were actually showing, what they were describing, what they were adding. And this is one of the familiar maps. Now, this big red blob is the United States of America. So what we learn very quickly here by looking at this is that through Google Maps, you see a lot about the United States, and there is a lot of information density in Google Maps about the United States. There is a lot about Germany, although the density is slightly slower, but there is a lot about Germany. There is a lot about Switzerland. There is a lot about Netherlands. And strangely enough, there's a lot about Norway. The rest of Europe is much smaller. The United Kingdom is surprisingly small. But the blob that signifies Europe is really big. This is the blob that signifies Europe. This is Africa. This is Latin America. And this here is Asia. Once again, the story emerges that as we see the world through Google Maps, we see a very transatlantic world. I can show you a little more here, breakdown by regions. You see that is the US and Canada in millions of content items. That is Latin America, that is Europe, that is Asia, and of course, that is Africa. Now, where does this leave us? We showed you a number of maps, and we used big data to analyze it and then color to visualize it. Particularly the last couple of maps that we showed you, we went out to the web, to the internet, and scraped the data almost in real time and analyzed it. Millions and millions of data entries. It's not looking at samples. It's not looking at experiments. It's looking at the real thing. And that real thing shows us knowledge as being lumpy, quite lumpy. That shouldn't surprise us. Knowledge in many other contexts is quite lumpy. You might know from studies of recipients of venture capital in the United States that 1/3 of all venture capital goes to just 2 small localities, the Silicon Valley and the Route 128. 2/3 of venture capital in the United States goes into 5 small localities. We add Silicon Alley, and we add San Diego, Los Angeles, and we add Austin, Texas, and then we're done. You find the same lumpiness when you look at recipients of National Science Foundation's grants in the United States. Knowledge as lumpy. Knowledge here, we found, was lumpy as well. Lumpy in different ways, but lumpy nevertheless. Lumpy around virtual communities, perhaps, rather than locations. Lumpy around perhaps certain cultures, certain socio-demographic elements, but lumpy not necessarily around connectivity or literacy, or not only around connectivity and literacy. And so when we try to understand and make sense of the knowledge of the world and its distribution, its geography, in a way, we need to give up on just trying to explain this lumpiness through enabling factors like literacy or internet penetration. We need to look at it holistically. Look at many different factors, education, leisure, but also cultural issues and cultural values that are so hard to gauge normally. And that is what we also have to look at when we want to change this, when we want to effectuate change, to provide a more comprehensive view for our children of what the world is like. It's not like we need to add more cables to Africa. It's not going to do it. Or send more books there. Or provide them with PCs. It's not going to do it. It's much harder because there are so many reinforcing elements in this machine that creates and reinforces knowledge. Not the least the fact that the West, the Europeans, the North Americans, also created the quality standards by which we assess what knowledge is good and what isn't. And with that, I could conclude here, save that in the true Steve Jobsian way, we have one more thing. And for that one more thing, I'll pass it on to Mark.
So all I'm going to do right now is show you two maps and tell you two stories. I'm going to talk about how we're expanding some of this work in a couple of directions. So one area involves moving beyond some of the Wikipedia work that I've showed to you already and asking a series of questions about where's represented, who's doing the representing, and who's most powerful or visible. And in particular, we're doing this in the Middle East and North Africa. And what we're doing exactly is we're looking at the region, we're looking at Wikipedia in the region, and we're looking at the Arabic, the English, the French, the Hebrew, and the Persian versions of Wikipedia, and we're asking three questions here. First of all, we're asking which parts of the region are more or less represented in all of those languages. And that's kind of what this map's getting at. That's what you're looking at here. This map shows you a pink or a salmon-colored country here or region means that there's more English articles than French articles about that place. A blue one means that there's more French articles than English articles about that place. So you see some quite interesting patterns. You see sort of Morocco and Algeria and a few parts of Egypt and Lebanon being more blue, so there's just a denser cloud of French information than English information about those places. Everywhere else, there's more English information. We're doing this with obviously Arabic and Hebrew and Persian too, and you see some very interesting patterns when you map those all out. But second, we're moving beyond this, and we're asking who's creating all of this. Are articles about Egypt, for instance, created by Egyptians, or are they created by people in Europe or North America? And then the final question we're asking is whose voices are loudest on this platform? So for instance, if Americans and Egyptians are writing about Egypt, who's most likely to have their content stick? Who's most likely to have their content be reverted? And what does that tell us about institutional or cultural barriers to participation? So that's all I'll tell you about this one. Let me show you another one. This is another area in which I'm expanding some of this work, building on some of the Google data that Victor talked about. What some colleagues and I are doing is mapping and understanding some of the geolinguistic contours of the web. And what that means is asking questions about the digital shadows of places and how they might be significantly different in different languages. And in practice, that means using content indexed in Google, using what Google knows about the world, to study both the relative amount of content produced about the same places in different languages and the ways in which that content might be annotating or describing different things. So in this map, for instance, what you're looking at is the relative amount of content in Spanish or Castilian and Catalan. A dot that's more red in this map means that there's more Catalan content about that place in Google. A dot that's more blue means that there's more Spanish content about that place. So you kind of see what you'd expect to see here. More Catalan content in Catalonia, more Spanish content almost everywhere else. And again, you see interesting patterns if you look at some other parts of the world. If you look at Israel and Palestine in Hebrew and Arabic, you see really interesting patterns. If you look at Canada and map English and French, if you look at Belgium and map Flemish and French. So as you might imagine, these sorts of mappings become quite interesting then, with all of the complex and unbalanced power dynamics between different linguistic groups. Now, ultimately, what all this work gets at is that what we've seen is that connectivity is clearly a prerequisite for a lot of participation in 21st century platforms of knowledge sharing and participation. But what we see is that connectivity is by no means a determinant of any of these things. It's by no means a determinant of people creating and sharing content. And so because of that, I think it's important for us to keep pushing at these sorts of questions and asking where visibility, voice, and power reside in our increasingly networked world. That is all I'm going to show you. That's all we have to say today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victor, Mark. I think we all learned something, and it shows, as I promised you, that the world is not as connected as we think, and there is a big need that we work on this. We want to invite you now to participate with questions.